Good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library's webinar on the history of the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation with author and journalist David Maraniss. I'm Gary Krenz. I'll introduce David in a moment, but as many of you know by now, I want to say first that as the archives of the University of Michigan, the Bentley Library acknowledges that the historical origins and present locations of the university were made possible by cession of lands by Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples under coercive treaties common in the colonization and expansion of the United States. We note in particular the grant of land made by the Anishinaabe under the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids for the College at Detroit so that their children could be educated. These lands continue to be the homeland of Indigenous people, and we seek to reaffirm and respect their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and to recognize their contributions to the university. I want to thank the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literature for co-sponsoring tonight's talk, and a special thanks to Professor Julie Heifel of that department for helping us to organize the event. Now, we have on Making Michigan explored the era of the 1930s to the 1950s at U of M 2 or 3 times over the past couple of years. The era of the Spanish Civil War, World War II, and the Red Scare, all of which had impact on and import for U of M. Tonight we have a unique and fascinating take on this era from David Maraniss, whose recent book, A Good American Family, deals with his parents and their generation as they are caught up in these times. David Maraniss is a journalist and associate editor at the Washington Post and is the author of 12 books, among them Once in a Great City, a Detroit Story, They Marched into Sunlight, War and Peace, Vietnam and America, October 1967, as well as, biographies of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Roberto Clemente. David is also a fellow of the Society of American Historians and visiting distinguished professor at Vanderbilt University, where in fact he is situated this evening. He has been affiliated with the Washington Post for more than 40 years as an editor and writer, and twice won Pulitzer Prizes at the newspaper in 1993 for his coverage of Bill Clinton, and in 2007 as part of a team that covered the Virginia Tech shooting. He has won many other major writing awards, including the George Polk Award, the Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize, the Anthony Lucas Book Prize, and the Frankfurt eBook Award. A Good American Family is his 12th book, and his next book, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe, is forthcoming in August. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you, Gary. It's great to be with you, and I can't tell you how much valuable research I was able to do at the Bentley Historical Library, so I'm especially happy to be doing this event.
Well, thank you so much. So let me say first that I think A Good American Family was just a wonderful read. It's personal and yet objective. It's thoughtful, reflective, and both intellectually and emotionally honest. And I really learned a lot from it. You say at the beginning, think of this story as a wheel. The hearing in room 740 is the hub where all the spokes connect. Now, I imagine that a lot of people in our audience read the book, but maybe some have not. So maybe we can begin here. What exactly happened in room 740 of the Federal Building in Detroit, and specifically on March 12th, 1952?
Well, the House Un-American Activities Committee came to Detroit that February and March to hold hearings, primarily to try to go after members of the United Auto Workers and the left-leaning people in that union. But they held, on March 12th, my father was called before the committee to testify. And he had already been summarily fired from his job at the Detroit Times when he got issued the subpoena. But what I wanted to do is not just write about my father, but a confluence of all the different forces and people that were in that room. So it includes the chairman of the committee, a Southern racist who was pronouncing my father un-American. It includes a FBI informant who named hundreds of names, a woman who had been recruited by the FBI to infiltrate the Communist Party in Michigan. It included my father's lawyer, familiar to everyone in Michigan, George Crockett, the a future congressman who was then a civil liberties lawyer. And my uncle, Bob Cummins, who was also called before the committee and also suffered as a result and was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. So many different elements I wanted to bring together to really talk about the question of what does it mean to be an American?
Thank you. Yeah. So your father's path. Let's start with him
Sure.
for obvious reasons. So his path to Room 740 took him from New York, where he grew up,
Yes.
to the University of Michigan, where he worked for the Michigan Daily, and importantly, obviously, met your mother. And then through service in the Second World War, and onto a career as a newspaperman. Until, as you say, at least for a while, he was abruptly out of that business because of being subpoenaed by HUAC. And part of what you're trying to do is understand his sort of attraction and commitment to communism during this period, and then the leaving of it. And I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about your father as a person, and what your reflections
Sure.
on his communist ties, and have you thought about anything else since you finished the book? New insights.
Well, it's something I will think about for the rest of my life, and I won't ever have all of the answers because for various reasons I was never able to thoroughly interview my father about that period. Um, but by the time I reached political consciousness, my father had survived that period, the 5 years of blacklisting, and moved on to a very successful career, returning into journalism, ending up as the editor of the Capital Times, a progressive paper in Madison, Wisconsin. And he really did not look back much at all, and certainly did not feel comfortable talking to me about that whole period. But so this was an exploration for me to try to understand. And some of the answers to why he was attracted to communism are pretty obvious and idealistic. He grew up in New York City during his adolescence was during the depths of the Depression. He saw the failures of the capitalist system at work during those difficult years. He also had a very strong vein of civil rights and civil liberties running through him from a pretty early age, and saw the racism in this country and the ways to combat it, and saw the Communist Party as actually fighting for the rights of African Americans. So those are two of the reasons, and also the fear of the fascists, right? The rise of fascism in Germany and Italy during that period. I'm of a different generation, but in some ways makes it more understandable for me because I was in college during the mid and late 1960s when there were similar movements and similar attractions to leftist causes for idealistic reasons. So I think that's what drew my father to it. I also, in the book, I also did not really interview my mother about this period either. They're both gone by the time I started to research the book. But if I had to say, I would say my mother was a little more ideological than my dad, even. And so part of it was drawn by his deep love for my mother.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, when you think about people's motivations for things, right? I mean, there are issues of loyalty sometimes. There are issues of ideology sometimes. Sometimes, if you look at maybe some of the members of the HUAC, sometimes these are just power plays, right? I mean, it's the
Yeah,
ability to
absolutely.
assert power over people. Yeah, I just wondered if you had reflections about that.
Well, the hearings were essentially a sham, and they were just done for publicity reasons and to force people to renounce their personal, political, ideological convictions in a country that is, based on civil liberties and freedom of the press and free speech. And so, the FBI had been tailing my dad for years before the committee came to Detroit. They had been investigating him essentially since after he left the University of Michigan. They already knew about him. They knew that he wasn't trying to violently overthrow the government. The whole purpose of the hearings was to embarrass, humiliate, or force people to renounce their past and to name names. And my father, while speaking strongly about First Amendment rights, decided to take the Fifth Amendment, which many did, some didn't, because he didn't want to name names. And but he suffered in either case.
Right, right. Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, we talked just a little bit earlier about Chandler Davis, who
Yes.
relied on his First Amendment rights, which was somewhat unusual at the time. But the state, your father.
It was, but the Hollywood 10 also did that, and they ended up in jail before this period. And after this period, Arthur Miller, another University of Michigan graduate, cited First Amendment rights, and he was convicted, but never ended up in jail. It was overturned. But he too, like Chandler Davis. And by the way, if Chandler and Natalie Davis are in the audience, I received a wonderful note from Natalie after this book came out, and I was honored by that.
So your father tried to read a statement during his testimony, but that was disallowed by the chair. That was standard practice. I mean, this was not a situation in which somebody given testimony was allowed really to speak what they wished to say. But you have that statement, and you in fact you devote a chapter of the book to presenting it. And one of the things that struck me about that was that there are some other things about this that I'd like to talk about maybe a little later. But since we're on this topic right now, it's a virtual manifesto about the First and Fifth Amendments as kind of central to the American system. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit of your thinking about that, his thinking about that, and maybe your own thinking about that as a journalist.
Sure. Well, let me say first, Gary, that he did try to read the statement. If he had named names, they would have let him do it. But because he took the Fifth Amendment, they wouldn't let him speak. Witnesses at those hearings did not have normal rights of a jury trial in any way. So the statement was submitted, but then disappeared. It wasn't covered in the papers, and it just was buried at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. for decades until I started doing this book. And all of the House Un-American Activity files had been opened, and I went there and found them, and there was a folder that said Elliot Maraniss, and the first thing in it was this incredible statement. Of all the reporting I've done over so many subjects over decades, reading that statement probably had the most profound visceral effect on me. And it made me realize for the first time, after all the years that I was with my dad, it made me really think about what it must have been like for him at that most difficult moment of his life, as he was typing out that statement. And the statement itself, I was moved by. It didn't surprise me because I knew my father as a very good, terrific writer, very accessible but intelligent at the same time. And I'd heard him, he didn't speak to me about that period, but he talked a lot about freedom of the press over the many years that we were journalists together. And that the statement is a very strong, is manifesto, as you said, because it is a little rhetorical, but about, his role and his duties as an American citizen, the right of dissent and freedom of speech and freedom of the press, going back to Peter Zenger and all of the brave journalists who were, fighting against the Alien and Sedition Act in the dawn of this country, all the way through this period. He knew that very well. And he also had been, bringing this back to Michigan, he'd been the editorial editor of the Michigan Daily and really had journalism in his blood deeply. And that comes through in this letter as well, the rights of freedom of the press. And the statement then turns about what it means to be an American and comparing it with this members of this committee and what, their definition of Americanism and the limits of that, a committee that was as un-American as anything could be, going against the Bill of Rights and denying him his rights as an American citizen who was not doing anything but speaking his mind. So in every possible way, I found that statement to be sort of the driving force of my book. And I felt almost as though he wrote it for me to find, all these decades later. When the book first came out, wherever I went, I was able to read his statement, the statement that he was not allowed to read.
Right. Well, it is very powerful. I mean, when he sort of turns and charges the committee with exactly what they have charged him with, it's a very, very powerful statement, a very powerful moment, I think. So another person, of course, who was summoned, as you mentioned earlier, to room 740 was your uncle, Robert Cummins. And his path to that room led him through the Spanish Civil War in the company of some other U of M people that actually have been discussed in this space on other occasions, Ralph Neefus and Edmund Service. Yes. And I wonder if you could just again, tell us a little bit about his experience with the war and maybe part of your experience kind of following some of his footsteps.
My Uncle Bob was kind of a romantic, heroic figure in our family lore. He didn't talk too much about his experience either. When we knew him, he told a little bit to my older brother, Jim, who was a Spanish scholar. And so that gave him a little more insight into that period. But my Uncle Bob was a few years older than my dad, and he graduated in 1937. And right at the end of his, that day in June, he and Edmund Service together went to New York and met up with Ralph Neefus, the third of the Michigan students, who, by the way, had been driven to New York City by none other than Arthur Miller, the playwright, who wrote that all the way during that drive, when he'd look over at Ralph, he thought he was looking at a dead man, kind of a shuddering thought. So they going to fight in the Spanish Civil War as an American was against the law. So they all said that they were just going to tour Europe. They took a boat from New York City to France, took a train across France to the border in the Pyrenees with Spain, spent 3 days climbing over the Pyrenees, and then down into Spain to fight for the Loyalists in the Spanish Civil War against Francisco Franco and the fascists. My uncle was called a runner during that period. He would send messages between different companies. It's generally called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, but that's actually a misnomer. Mm-hmm. It was the International Brigade, and there was an Abraham Lincoln Battalion within that brigade. But there was also another battalion called the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, which was made up not exclusively, but primarily of Canadian volunteers, along with some Americans and some European soldiers as well. My Uncle Bob was in the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, as was Ralph Neefus. Edmund Service survived the war. He was best friends with James Lardner, the son of Ring Lardner, who was killed in the war. And Ralph Neefus was captured and imprisoned in a cathedral in the town of Alcanith. And there he and several other soldiers were executed by Franco's troops. And when I went to Spain to research that part of the book, I followed the route of my Uncle Bob and the various battles that he fought in, mostly along the Ebro River, which was kind of a central battleground of the war. But also went to the town of Alcañiz and into that cathedral, which stands at the top of the highest hill in the town, as most of those cathedrals would. And walking into that cathedral, I still felt like it was a dungeon of doom. All of these many decades later, there were flickering votive candles, and it was sort of dank, and you could just, to me, it smelled like death. And thinking about Ralph Neefus and what happened to him there, a young Michigan student. These men, many of them were affiliated with the Young Communist League. They were attracted to this war for idealistic reasons, to fight fascism. They didn't have to go. They weren't drafted. It wasn't in a sense their nation's war, but they had a larger calling. And one of them didn't get back. But when my Uncle Bob and Elman Service returned to Michigan, the student body came out in force to honor them upon their return. And it's actually at one of those meetings of the Spanish Civil War, supporting the Spanish Civil War soldiers, that my parents met. My dad was covering it for the Michigan Daily, and my mother was there because her older brother was fighting in the war. And that's why I exist, because of that.
Because of that, right. At one point, there was a fear that your uncle had been captured.
Yes.
And your father actually played a role in resolving that issue.
Well, yeah, a photocopy of a photograph that one of my great aunts had seen in a paper in Spokane, Washington, of these captured soldiers. It looked like one of them was my Uncle Bob. And but my father, working at the Michigan Daily, was able to get the actual photograph over the wires, and he could determine that it was not him. And also, my uncle was writing letters, but not to his mother, because he didn't tell her where he was going. But he wrote them to his friends at the Michigan Daily, and my father also saw those.
Yeah, wow. So both your Uncle Bob and your father worked at the Michigan Daily, and in fact, right, I mean, it was the prospect of working at the Daily was one of the things that attracted your father to Michigan, right? As it did Arthur Miller, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and
I can't say enough about how good the Michigan Daily was in that period. I mean, I've read newspapers my whole life, and the Daily in that period was as sophisticated in its international coverage, its political coverage, and its coverage of society and culture and literature as, far more than most daily newspapers, I would say.
Yeah, you say at one point that the paper's interests clearly reflected the seriousness of the era.
Yes.
And so here we are again. I mean, we're in a serious era now, obviously, for many reasons. And what advice might you give editors and reporters at the Daily now about how to think about this era that we're in?
Well, boy, it's I think about that even for my own newspaper, the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the traditional methods of coverage are being challenged greatly by the proliferation of disinformation and outright lies by politicians. I mean, that's always been part of the reality, but never more so than now. And the parallels between then and now are a little broader. They have to do with the demonization of others. Then it was leftists, and now it's Muslims and people from south of the border, or refugees, immigrants, people seeking a better life. But they're all considered others by some segment of the American population, even though it's a country of immigrants. And also, the other similarity is the manipulation of the truth. by people in power, which is another thing that, so for journalists, my only advice can always be to search for the truth wherever it takes you, and be skeptical but not cynical. Cynicism turns you off to searching for the truth in some ways, and just keep at it. Just keep doing the job despite everything around you. What you're doing is so important for this democracy, which is really imperiled.
You write at one point that your father had a particular interest in the issue of manipulation of language and so forth. I mean, writing was one of his main loves, and the proper use of language, it seems.
Yeah, my dad, I wouldn't call him an intellectual, but he was a wonderful reader and admirer. He had some great English professors at University of Michigan, who he would talk about a lot. And he by the time I got to talk to him about serious things, one of his favorite writers was Orwell. And not Orwell's novels, which are, made him famous, 1984 and Animal Farm, but his essays. And what my father loved most about those and sort of inculcated in me was, of course, Orwell had very strong political beliefs. He had core morality about him, but he also wasn't blinded because of those beliefs and was open to the truth where it took him. And so my father saw in Orwell the clarity of language, that so many, it could be so manipulated by others for nefarious reasons. And he wrote about that as a student, and it sort of was one of his guiding lights as a writer for the rest of his life in journalism. He wrote with a clarity that seemed simple but was really complex. He was able to take complex ideas and simplify them into clarity.
You mentioned the influence of some English professors and so forth. What were some of the influences of U of M on him, or at U of M, I should say? And I mean, maybe most particularly your mother, I suppose.
I think my mother was the main influence. I'm sorry, Gary, I can't recite all of the professors by name anymore. I knew them a year ago when,
sure.
But it was, Michigan, I think, had the most profound influence on him of anything in his life. Growing up in Coney Island, New York, coming to the Midwest, he really found his home there. And it's kind of ironic because, of course, it was in Detroit where he suffered the trauma of the McCarthy era. But Michigan, he sort of adopted so many Midwestern. He became a homer for the Midwest in a lot of ways. It wasn't just his rooting for the University of Michigan, and then later when we moved to Madison, still rooting for Michigan, but also embracing Wisconsin. But just sort of the salt of the earth type of romanticism of that part of the country, combined with the intellectual firepower of the faculty at Michigan. That's what created my dad, and then along came my mother, and that really, I think in many ways, so the experience in Detroit when he was fired and called before the committee was the most dramatic experience of his life. But Michigan and then later Wisconsin also really shaped him for the better in so many ways.
Well, the experience at the Daily, which you talk about quite a bit, you paint some wonderful pictures of sort of life at the Daily in those days. And so I have a confession. I thought that I read at one point that your father thought of journalism as a political act, not a partisan act, but a political act. And I meant to double check this before the interview tonight, and I failed to do that. Am I remembering something correctly there? Or?
Well, you are, yes.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, my father viewed life as political, and he there's some really superficial notions about journalism of fair and balanced, and treating both sides equally. And my father was always just searching for what was right, what was decent,
Mhm.
what was the right thing to do, what was the truth. And so, luckily he found a newspaper in Madison, the Capital Times, which was sort of a crusading newspaper for progressive causes. It came out against the war in Vietnam before any paper in the country, would run front page notices of how many days it had been since Nixon and Kissinger declared peace was at hand. Um, and most importantly, in terms of my father's history, the Capital Times, although it was an anti-communist paper, it was more anti-communist, and took on Joe McCarthy from the very beginning fearlessly.
Mhm.
And that was also part of the Capital Times crusade and the political part of journalism.
Mhm. 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 So one of the clear currents in the book has to do with racism and anti-racism, and you
Yeah.
mentioned before that part of what led your father toward leftist politics was a concern about racism and a desire to fight racism, and that the Communist Party seemed to be four square in that corner. Um, and it's just kind of remarkable how this all follows through. I just wanted to read one passage or one very brief thing that you had written, and this has to do with the Detroit police squad that was
Uh,
charged with identifying communists and
right.
agitators. And you write, the police noted in their after action report, the following persons were recognized. And then they listed the names of all the protesters they could identify. In a reflection of the times, the list had one minor annotation, an asterisk denotes Negro.
Mm.
So not only is it important to identify a communist or a leftist or a radical, but it's doubly important to identify a black communist or leftist or radical. And this is just this, there are plenty of
Absolutely.
examples along these lines. And I
Yeah.
just wonder if would you just reflect on that for a minute? I mean, the place of racism in this whole story.
Well, I think the maybe one way to go at that question is to think about George Crocker, who was on the left. He was never a member of the Communist Party, but he saw deeply the connection between the role of civil liberties in protecting members of the Communist Party and the dilemma that African Americans faced. He saw the parallels of the dangers of both. Um, and that's why I was so I felt gratitude towards George Crocker for defending my father and for everything that he did during that period. Putting his own reputation and career on the line to defend people who were considered pariahs by the government at that period. My father's commitment to race and to civil rights and against racism was borne out most clearly to me during the Second World War, when he became the commander of an all-black unit that eventually ended up in Okinawa. And, just by chance or maybe fate or whatever, the letters that he wrote to my mother during that period, which I had not looked at before until I started researching this book. When my mother died, my wife and I cleaned out her apartment and sent all the letters to my sister Jeannie in Pittsburgh. And when I started the book, I wrote to Jean and said, can you send me all those letters? I'd like to look at them. And when I did, it was exactly what I was looking for. It was my father explaining the dilemma of race in America. And here he was, I mean, the military was as racist as any place. There were segregated units. There was a belief that African Americans shouldn't be the commanders of their own units, so they were almost exclusively white commanders, and those whites who were lieutenants or captains of those companies were chosen from two different, sort of diametrically different places. They were either Southern racists because the military thought, well, they've dealt with blacks and know how to do it,
Yeah.
or they were Northern radicals like my dad. And my father's understanding of the sort of nuances of what he was dealing with, being asked to lead soldiers who were being asked to fight for the liberty in a country where they were denied their own freedoms is very difficult, but part of American history. And so, the letters that he wrote explaining that went a long way to my understanding of my father and his commitment to racial justice, and something that he imbued in me and my kids and my nephews and everybody in our family. Sort of all stems from that the experiences of my dad,
Yeah.
and dealing with race in America.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, so his leadership of that unit, I mean, as you say, radicals. I mean, partly it was to
Right.
segregate the radicals
Exactly.
from other whites, right? So
Yeah.
the soldiers in the unit are segregated because of their color, and
Yeah.
the officers are segregated, at least in some cases, because of their politics. Right?
And before that, they were segregated even more. Most of them were sent up to Alaska, or
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma, or as far away from the action as they could be. But as the war progressed, just military demands, the needs to get more troops, sort of brought them back into. Some were able to go fight in Europe, and others in the Pacific, but before 1943 or 4, they were mostly just shunted aside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the, so we're not going to talk about all of the actors that are the spokes
Sure.
on this wheel. Although I wish we could, because you tell wonderful, you give wonderful accounts of them. And part of one of the things about those accounts is that it's all very even-handed and honest, and sometimes even sympathetic toward people who are on what we might now see as the wrong side of history here. And you mentioned Maraniss Baldwin, who was the mole in the
Right.
Communist Party, who outed your father with so many others. And you write of her, I can muster no hard feelings toward the woman who would name my father to the committee 2 weeks later. I have no desire to call her a rat or stoolie or any other derogatory characterization. There is another reason I found myself drawn to her story, more out of curiosity than anger. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that other reason and about your sort of attitude toward her.
Well, first of all, that's sort of part of my sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
If she had real power, I would have felt differently. So I certainly felt differently towards the chairman, John Stevenswood, the racist from Georgia, or Joe
Right.
McCarthy, or people who actually exercised the power. But Maraniss Baldwin it was a job. She was paid by the FBI to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed her grandchildren, and it was a pretty interesting experience because they didn't know what their grandmother had done until they found a bunch of clippings up in the closet long after she was dead. And one of the granddaughters said to me, "That was a really weird period, wasn't it?" And um, I sort of, I think she was trying to understand that as much about what her grandmother did as I was trying to understand about my father.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons I didn't hold a grudge against her. But the main reason is because I believe that it's the people who actually exercise the power that are the ones that have to be held in judgment. And she was sort of a pawn in larger sociological and political forces of that period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gary, I think there probably was another reason, but you'll have to
No,
give me a prompt if there was.
no. That's great. That's
Okay.
fine. So uh, I want to go back to the statement that your father
Sure.
submitted and just talk a little bit about the beginning. At the beginning of that, he says, the whole pattern of a life. In the 34 years of my life, in war and peace, I have been a loyal, law-abiding citizen of the United States. And then he goes on to say, he enlisted, he served 4 years in World War II, was honorably discharged. He's a homeowner, a taxpayer, and a parent. So all of those things sound like qualifications of a good American. Right? And I guess the question I want to ask is, maybe it's not so much what is a good American or a good American family. It's is it possible to give that phrase real meaning? Or is it inevitably a kind of a shibboleth, hiding a multitude of social sins and justifications of a myriad of repressions?
Yeah, that part of the statement, I mean, you can be none of those things and still be a good American, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So I think he was sort of playing into their stereotypes, or playing to them,
mm-hmm,
with that part of the statement. Um, and the title of the book and that whole notion of a good American family comes from another member of the committee from Michigan, Congressman Potter from Northern Michigan, who said that he was stunned to realize that there could be people from good American families who were attracted to communism. And, so from his definition of that, my family was a good American family in so many ways. But I don't think you can, I mean, I don't know how to define a good American. I mean, I think that dissent is a love of country as much as
mm-hmm,
and often more so than pseudo patriotism.
mm-hmm,
Why are you dissenting? Because you want things to be better, right?
mm-hmm,
So in that sense, that's what I try to honor in the book is that notion of love of country can take many forms, and one of the strongest forms is dissent to try to make this country live up to its ideals.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm going to open up to the audience questions in just a moment, but I did want to ask you sort of. I mean, you're a highly successful journalist and author, and how. What makes a good story? There's an unfair question, right? But what makes a good story?
Well, I don't know how to answer that except that to me, I have to be obsessed with a subject to make it a good story.
Uh-huh.
So I wouldn't want to define it for other people because there are, as many different perspectives as there are human beings on what they like. But for me, what I'm looking for in my books is a combination of a dramatic arc and a larger sociological or political meaning. So in each of the books I've written, including the book I'm just finishing on Jim Thorpe, the great Native American athlete, it's a dramatic story about his, the best athlete in American history. But more than that, it's a way to write about the experience of the Native American experience during his lifetime, which really sort of covers the gamut of that whole period when the basic philosophy of the American government was kill the Indian, save the man, meaning try to get all of the cultural Indianness out of them.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
and so, for all of my books, that's what I'm looking for, a dramatic arc and a larger meaning to
mm-hmm,
illuminate American history.
mm-hmm,
What makes a good story for anyone else, it's up to them.
mm-hmm. That's good. Well, you certainly have what is here a good story in my book.
Thank you.
So, is there any, you talked about the impact of finding that the HUAC statement, the statement to HUAC,
Yes.
and some of the other things. Is there an episode, any other episode of the book that that we haven't touched on that you might like to
Yeah, well, I
say
mean,
something
one
about?
of the, I've mentioned the chairman of the committee a few times, but what I haven't said about John Stevenswood is that not only, and here's the person determining whether my father is un-American.
Mm-hmm.
He was a racist from Georgia who had voted against every uh, civil rights measure that came through Congress during his period. He was elected in what was called the white primary, where blacks weren't even allowed to vote in Georgia during that era in the Democratic primary. As a young man, he briefly joined the Ku Klux Klan. And above all of that, as a young law clerk, he was involved in the most heinous lynching in Georgia history during that period, the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish industrialist in Atlanta who was wrongly convicted of raping and killing a 13-year-old worker in his pencil factory. And when after Leo Frank was convicted, he was sent to prison in Georgia, and there was so much pressure on the governor from the New York Times and all the northern newspapers. The Anti-Defamation League was actually formed because of that controversy over Leo Frank, that the governor commuted his death sentence. Didn't pardon him, but commuted his death sentence. And the powers that be in Georgia were so infuriated by that they seized Frank from his prison cell and took him down to Marietta, a field outside Marietta, and lynched him. And John Stevenswood, this future chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, who called my uncle and my father and Coleman Young and everyone else was called before that committee un-American, drove the car that carried Leo Frank's lynched body after, it's just, there are a lot of ways to be, I guess that's un-American, everything about that story. And he's the judge deciding, ruling on other people and ruining their lives.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a couple of questions that have come in. Let's see. When David's dad was fired from the Detroit Times, he couldn't find a job for 5 years, and the family had to move to a different city. David was quite young during this time, but does he remember anything? Do any personal details stand out?
Well, first we moved to New York, and I was 3. My older sister and brother remembered much more about that than I do. I think I have vague memories of Coney Island, but I visited there many times after that. So, sometimes you merge memories.
Right.
I do remember when we lived in Cleveland. It was the one time during those 5 years that my dad was able to get another newspaper job for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Although it's not long after he did, the FBI came to the Plain Dealer and said, "You hired a former communist," and they fired him.
Yeah.
But I remember that. And I remember the look on my dad's face a couple of times during that period. I didn't really understand what was going on, but as a little kid, you can see into somebody's face and know something's wrong. And I definitely remember that. My older brother and sister went to many different schools during that period, from New York to Ann Arbor to Detroit to Cleveland to Detroit, and then finally to Bettendorf, Iowa, where my father worked on a labor paper for a year before we were all saved when we moved to Madison. So I remember moving a lot. But again, I was the little kid in the family, and when you're a little kid, you just go along with what the family's doing. I remember sort of a vague sense of unease. And that's about the strongest memory I have.
Mm-hmm.
Besides living in Detroit, I remember looking out the back window and seeing rats running in and out of our garage. So I've had a rat phobia my whole life after that.
Right. Second question here is thank you for your bravery in sharing this story that sheds light on a dark time in our history. Where do you think the country stands now on our understanding of the First and Fifth Amendments?
I don't think the country will ever understand the Fifth Amendment. I think that there's an assumption that it just means you're guilty, and they don't really understand why it is part of our legal system and part of democracy. As for the First Amendment, I think it's endangered. I think it's endangered in America as well as around the world.
Mm-hmm.
The freedom of the press. And, ironically, one of the dangers is internal and comes from the proliferation of news sources, which is, in one sense, a wonderful democratic thing, and in another sense is undermining democracy because people are able to have such tunnels of information and of misinformation that it's really been a challenge to the truth. I think we're on a razor's edge right now, and as much as any time since the McCarthy era, in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, there are just lots of these issues. And one of the things about that sort of public stance toward the Fifth Amendment, I mean, that's ammunition for those who wish to, like you act, that's ammunition for the committee, right?
Yes,
To,
absolutely. And one of
to,
the things about all of the civil liberties that it's hard for people to understand is that they're most profoundly challenged when something is unpopular. So that, my defense of the First Amendment and of the Fifth Amendment has to extend to people that I ideologically despise. But I
mhm.
think that's you have to be able to hold that contradiction to really uphold those, freedom of speech. And so, that's where I stand on that.
Here's a question about your research. What portion of David's research was online, looking through the digitized daily, for example, and how much of it was looking through physical papers at places like the Bentley?
Well, I have to say that right when I was doing this book, you folks at the Bentley gave me a heads up several months before you went public with your digitized editions and let me look at it that way. It probably saved me 3 or 4 months because I could type in Elliot Maraniss and every story he ever wrote or anything about him was there. Same for my father, same for Arthur Miller, same for Spanish Civil War. It was a godsend. But other than that, I would say, that was the rest of the book was not from the internet at all. It was many of the Bentley files were, clippings and old documents. That's where I learned more about Ralph Neefus and Elman Service and George Crockett, who went to law school in Michigan, and my dad and uncle, all in those files. The Tamiment Library in New York City holds all the files of the Spanish Civil War, the Abraham Lincoln files, which were of enormous help to me. The Georgia Historical Society had really illuminating files on the chairman of the committee. The Detroit police files were at the Detroit Public Library. So I almost all of it, except for the digitized Michigan Daily, which was great. The rest of it was from just plain old-fashioned archives.
Right, right. Yeah, the digital daily has proven to be just a wonderful resource
Oh,
for people. I mean, it's fantastic
absolutely.
in so many ways. But yes, you still sometimes or often have to have somebody bring something from the stacks. Right?
Yep.
So, yeah. Let's see. What do you think? Well, so this touches on something that we were talking about a little bit earlier. What do you think can be done about the misinformation that is permeating our discourse?
It's a really difficult question. Um, there are some efforts to sort of provide information on what are reliable sources, to sort of try to do a non-ideological but in-depth report on all of the many places that people can get information. But the only ones who are going to look at that are librarians and and people who are already pretty wise about these things. So I think that there's a responsibility from many of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. They claim they're just platforms, but they are more than that, and they have to be held responsible.
Mhm.
And they're just barely starting to in some ways, but it's a fine line even there in terms of freedom of speech. So, and you can kick somebody off Twitter and they'll find another place. It's like whack-a-mole in that sense.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult question, but and it's further endangered now than ever because of what's going on in the public school systems in so many different parts of the country, where they're banning books, burning books. Tennessee, where I am right now, the governor wants to bring in charter schools run by Hillsdale College, this reactionary college in Michigan,
Right.
to
Not
run
far
the
from here.
charter schools.
Mhm.
And the Hillsdale demagoguery claims that Martin Luther King was a rabble rouser and a troublemaker. I mean, is that going to be taught in the Tennessee schools now?
Right.
So you have to fight this or respond to it at every possible level. In the public schools, the journalists searching for the truth. And it's a really, I don't feel, I'm an optimist, but I know how deeply troubling this situation is right now.
Yeah, it does feel sometimes like we're at really sort of a big inflection point in history when it comes to communications. And, and we're at this point when we are at so many danger points in so many other ways.
The optimist is in me, I teach at Vanderbilt, and I love the students here, and I'm sure you feel that way about the students at Michigan or
Mhm.
Yale or wherever anyone is. So whether that's naive or not, I have more faith in the next generation than I do in my own generation, which, I thought we were an idealistic generation, the baby boomers, but that's the generation that elected Donald Trump.
Right.
But in so many
Right.
ways, I think the younger
Yeah.
generation is more advanced on a lot of social issues.
Mhm. Would you compare the situation, that situation, I don't know if that means the situation we're just talking about now, with any other conflict since the 1940s? Maybe Laura can give us a little clarification on that. But let me read, there is a
Well, I think
comment.
the
This is, yeah,
30s, the 60s, and today are sort of three inflection points, that have similarities. Of real, the world was on edge in the 30s, in the 60s, and today. There were serious questions about the role of dissent in American life. And there was an activist, I mean, at least in the late 30s and the late 60s, there was a very activist student movement to try to make things better.
Right, right. Let me just read, this is a comment, not so much a question. Thanks so much for sharing with us all these experiences. I am Spanish, and the echoes of the International Brigade still resonate in the country's history. I was a teenager in the 80s and remember with emotion and homage to organized in Barcelona to those brave people. They traveled thousands of miles to fight fascism in a country in which most of them had no ties at all. So just a comment from somebody in the audience.
That's very nice. And, traveling through Catalonia and Aragon some along the Ebro River, Spain has really sort of, at least that part of Spain has really honored the Spanish Civil War in so many ways that all these small towns have museums that are about the Spanish Civil War. And many of the battlefields are still there. and so a lot of the ruins from, the Condor Legion, the German bombers, a lot of the churches and other buildings in the small towns are still the ruins of what happened during that war. But I still felt it all of these many, many decades later, and I know that people in Spain do as well.
Mhm, mhm. Well, David, I think it's probably time for us to wrap up. I certainly want to thank you for this discussion. The book, again, for our audience, and those who don't know about it, is A Good American Family: The Red Scare and My Father. And we've only been able to touch on highlights. I really recommend it. Thanks as always to Lara Zeeland for her behind the screen support for the webinar, as well as the Michigan media team, which has managed tonight's event. And thanks again to Julie Heifel and the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures. Thank you to the audience. This session will be available on our website in a week or so. In April, Making Michigan will take a different form. We will be holding a virtual symposium to mark the reopening of U of M's historic Detroit Observatory. Information and registration will be available on our website, detroitobservatory.umich.edu, next week. I hope you can join us for that. Until then, be safe, keep well, and stay strong. Good night.